This is our interview with Matt McManus. Matt is going to be with us all weekend on a panel later today.
Yep.
You gonna be able to be here tomorrow as well, or just today?
Just today, because tomorrow I am serving as a discussant and a chair on an MPSA panel, and since I'm the chair, I better be there.
Okay. So Matt's going to be with us for the rest of the day today, and I am going to conduct a brief interview with him and then open up to him. I know that you wrote a guide to cosmopolitan socialism in honor of your friend Michael Brooks, who passed away, and you're working on a book called Liberal Socialism?
That's right. Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, which, I'm guessing should be out by November, but don't quote me on that.
Could you use the mics for the...
Oh, sure. Yeah, the Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, which, don't quote me on this, should be out by November or so, I think.
And many other works. Matt's very prolific and a professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan, or of political science. Okay. So as I said, I'm Spencer Leonard. I'm going to ask Matt just 4 questions and then open it up to the rest of you. I thought I'd begin, Matt, by asking you about your own journey to the left, when and how you were politicized, and if you could be specific about the events or experiences in the world, as well as key intellectual developments that you may have experienced in terms of books you read, people you encountered, whether teachers or peers who become teachers, or whom you teach, and any leftist organizations that you may have engaged in your early political development.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks a lot for inviting me to this. I'm very happy that a lot of people are here. A little bit nerve-wracking also. I suppose the key formative moment for me in my transition to left was, like so many other millennials, 9/11, right? I remember when I was in middle school, I was mostly listening to Blink-182, really very bad at skateboarding, right? And then, of course, 9/11 happened. The Bush regime immediately went to war in Afghanistan, and then very quickly after went to Iraq. And like many other people at that time, I was outraged by this. I wouldn't be able to tell you that I had any kind of consistent political theory, let alone any kind of strong systematic way of thinking about things that explain this, but I knew that it was wrong, and I felt very passionately that something needed to be done about this. So when I was in high school, I was involved in organizations like Amnesty International or the Red Cross, where we spent a lot of time protesting the war, writing to members of parliament, trying to get it stopped, very unsuccessfully, I should say, which was my first taste of leftist defeat, I should say. And then I suppose the big thing for me after that were some mentors of mine at Carleton University, where I did my undergraduate degree. So my undergraduate supervisor was a man named Trevor Purvis, who was kind of a cosmopolitan Marxist. Also, liked to grab beer and eat wings. That was our big thing, talk Marxist theory. And he was the one who really convinced me to take Marx and Marxism a lot more seriously than I had before. Up until that point, as a kind of lapsed Catholic, after about the age of 18, the primary theoretical sources that I had drawn upon were people like Nietzsche or like Heidegger. So there's probably another universe where, I'm a staunch right-winger, right? Because I never kind of was weaned off of that. But Trevor, as a very formative influence on me, got me to read Das Kapital, got me to read Zizek, especially The Sublime Object of Ideology, and that kind of intellectually set me on the path that I was on. And in terms of other leftist
When was that?
That was, back in 2008, right? When Green Day was still, popular. Stone Age, basically. But in terms of, other leftist organizations that I've been involved in Canada, I was a member of the New Democratic Party and the Socialist Caucus for the New Democratic Party. Currently, I'm a member of Detroit DSA, although I was involved in Huron Valley DSA. And then, most importantly of all, I'm part of a Marx Hegel reading group at the University of Michigan, where we gather each week to read The Phenomenology of Spirit, which is surprisingly actually a lot of fun, especially if you have enough beer to kind of help it go down a little bit easier.
Okay. One thing I appreciate you, Matt, is your liberal sensibility when it comes to engaging with others. Something that I experienced as editor of Sublation magazine when I solicited from you a response to the article whose publication eventually caused me to step down from that position. In that article, you thanked Ben Burgess for his suggestions. The name of that article is Defending Bhaskar Sankara. And of course, you and Ben are both philosophers and both regular contributors to the magazine that Bhaskar Sankara edits, Jacobin. Could you tell me something about how you understand that intellectual milieu around Jacobin? Obviously, there are more than just you, Ben, and Bhaskar, many more. How you understand it in terms of your own participation and how it's evolved and what sort of intellectual, political school that has been for you.
Absolutely, right. So I first encountered Jacobin, I guess actually in my second to last year of college, around 2009 or so, where a couple of my friends put it up on, the internet, and kind of like, well, what is this? This seems a little bit weird. But it was a really formative read for me to encounter a lot of those articles. Not because I agreed with everything back then, or because I agree with everything that Jacobin publishes now. It's an ecumenical magazine for that reason. But because what they really made clear to me was that there was a modern, at that point, young socialist tradition that was emerging in the United States that was committed to this idea of socialism, not necessarily just a kind of left liberalism per se. And that really intrigued me in the sense that I thought, wow, it is actually possible to still advocate for this position in the United States or in Canada and to be backed up in that with an array of different comrades, many of who will have extraordinarily different ideas than I will, but nonetheless, we share certain kinds of political goals. I guess the first piece that I wrote for them was back in 2017 when I just graduated from my PhD. It was The Lies of Originalism, I think. A very measured piece, as you can tell by the title, since I had done my degree in socio-legal studies, and it was a critique of different problems I saw with originalist approaches to constitutional interpretation. But I really started engaging with them a lot more pronouncedly, I guess starting back in 2019, with the help of my really good friend and editor, Sean Goodday, right, who's a marvelous editor and also is writing a very exciting new book on Eugene Debs, which will hopefully be out sometime soon. And also spent a lot of time in Chicago, so that's nice. And what I really appreciated about Jacobin was that when I started writing about them, it was very clear that they didn't always agree with what I was floating them. And I know that a lot of the readers didn't like what I wrote because I would sometimes get very angry emails from them about my pieces on Jordan Peterson, or my pieces on Nietzsche, or my pieces on Heidegger. But this ecumenical spirit, providing a big tent for the broader American socialist movement, I thought was a really worthy aspiration. And I'm still committed to it to this day. And I think that you can see the impact of publications like Jacobin in the kind of small but kind of emerging popular literature on the left. Things like, say, Current Affairs magazine by Nathan Robinson, which has also grown in popularity and that I've also published for, or indeed the kind of intellectual careers of a lot of people who started at Jacobin, like Bhaskar Sankara, who wrote a very good book, The Socialist Manifesto, that I can personally tell you, having talked to a lot of different students, has been inspiration not just for a lot of younger millennials, but also for Zoomers as well, to take an interest in socialism.
Great. Okay, now I want to dig in a little bit, and I haven't, obviously I think you're still, maybe you finished the manuscript for liberal socialism, but it's
got the final draft done, just waiting for the introduction from my wife, and I'm not going to rush that because the last thing you want to do is rush your wife on anything. But yeah, it should be in by May, I think.
So I've just listened to what you've said about it. Your project you describe as liberal socialism, which you sometimes treat as bringing together the liberal and socialist traditions. But of course, socialism itself emerged out of liberalism by its own account. And Marx, for his part, understood himself in relation formatively with Adam Smith, Hegel, and German idealism generally, and the French Revolution. And classical liberalism or bourgeois ideology thought of itself as expressive of a historically emerging form of society, right? It had an account of its own conditions of possibility, right, in historical change. And Marx likewise understood socialism and his own eminent critique of it as expressive of broader social and historical conditions. In effect, bourgeois society as transformed in and through its own realization and crisis in the Industrial Revolution. So my question is, isn't in some sense socialism already liberal in a deeper sort of historical sense of a outgrowth of the crisis of liberal society or bourgeois society? And isn't Marx and really socialism more generally in its self-understanding no less the heir of classical liberalism than are self-described liberals?
Yes, I think a lot of that is right? So Eric Hobsbawm, in his book, The Age of Revolutions, points out that one of the things that was distinctive about socialism is that socialism constituted a critique of bourgeois society that was novel in the sense that it drew from a lot of the same Enlightenment principles and Enlightenment modes of reasoning as liberalism is itself. And this posed a serious problem for many liberals because by the 19th century, almost any liberal thinker worth their salt had had plenty of practice criticizing reactionary critiques of bourgeois society, right? You think about Thomas Paine's famous critique of Edmund Burke, or Mary Wollstonecraft's famous critique of Edmund Burke, or the American Revolutionaries' critique of the monarchy, all the way going back to somebody like Locke and his critique of Robert Filmer. Socialism was a new beast, and since it talked a lot of the same talk and walked a lot of the same walk as liberals, people like Alexis de Tocqueville, for example, were horrified by it and deeply concerned that there might be some legitimacy to this claim that socialism was going to be the wave of the future. But on the broader point about the kind of symmetry or dissymmetry or asymmetry between liberalism and socialism, I just want to talk a little bit about that from a clarificatory point of view before moving into what Marx himself, I think, would think about this project. So one of the things that I make clear in my book is that any socialist has to be critical of a huge number of dimensions to liberalism. And this is particularly true of classical liberalism, or what the great Canadian political theorist C.P. Macpherson calls possessive individualism. So Macpherson, like Marx, will point out that classical liberalism had an important role to play in emancipating the working orders in the sense that it postulated this idea that all human beings were equal and entitled to a certain degree of freedom. Now, of course, every classical liberal thinker drew an enormous number of exceptions on this point, which the Marxist Domenico Lacerda points out are not all insignificant. But this rhetorical commitment to equality and freedom for all, however compromised it happened to be, was historically innovative. There's no denying that, right? Especially when you think that antiquarian or medieval political philosophers and ideologists were very, very hostile to anything that intimated that idea. They were very committed to this idea of a society that was fundamentally hierarchical in its very bones, right? The problem, of course, with classical liberalism is that by becoming so attached to the mechanisms and procedures of market society, many classical liberals came to endorse very readily new forms of inequality that I would argue in some ways are more domineering than the ones that they replaced. So in aristocratic societies, for example, many of the defenders of aristocracy would insist that the upper orders had an obligation to the lower orders based on the sense of noblesse obligée. And this had deep ideological roots in the thinkings of people like Robert Filmer, where Filmer would say, look, God ordains that there be high and there be low, but much like a good father is kind to his children, even though he's still the head of the household, the king has to treat his children, his subjects like they themselves are children, right? Whereas with classical liberalism, you find put forward in the works of people like Locke, let alone people like Malthus, this idea that, look, we all start from a position of equality, and then the rational and the industrious, through their efforts, rise, and they owe nothing to anybody else. Certainly no obligation based on noblesse obligée. And the inverse of this, of course, is this idea that the poor, right, if they wind up at the bottom of the social hierarchy, they are purely responsible for their actions, because since we all start from a standpoint of equality, they could have risen had they been rational and industrious enough, but they failed to do so, right? And I think that critical theorists like Wendy Brown have pointed out how this possessive account of liberalism eventually metastasized into ruling ideologies, like what we see under neoliberalism contemporaneously, that are extraordinarily toxic and corrosive. So in this respect, socialists, of course, have to be very critical of many aspects of the liberal tradition. And in fact, we need to be more critical, I'd say, now than ever, of many aspects of the possessive liberal tradition, precisely because neoliberalism has been so ubiquitous for a long period of time. Now, saying that, what I point out in my book is that there has always been another, more egalitarian dimension to liberalism that is not only worth recovering, but indeed retrieving for the purposes of socialist projects. Elizabeth Anderson, who some people might be familiar with, actually released a very good book on this recently called Hijacked, where she points out that many of the same possessive arguments made for inequality were also mobilized by early leftists like the Levelers, right, to argue for more pronounced economic equality. But putting it very quickly, right, what I point out in my book is that the egalitarian strain of liberalism that first emerges with Thomas Paine started to become very critical, very quickly, of the presuppositions that were baked into classical liberalism about, for example, the immutability of private property and the necessity of the kinds of inequalities that are going to emerge in bourgeois society. So Paine, for instance, is one of the first figures anteceding socialism to actually say, look, property is fundamentally a social institution. The rich benefit from the legality of property. And consequently, the rich should be very heavily taxed to provision for the poor, because the poor are poor through no fault of their own. Mary Wollstonecraft, again, also in this tradition, anteceding socialism, makes an argument that to be truly committed to liberal values is to recognize, as she put it famously in her letters, that the rich are a kind of fungus on society. They reap where they do not sow, and this generates a huge amount of corrosion in society, because it means that the people who rule society are often the most disconnected from those that they're ruling, which is something that has to be rectified. Now, liberal socialism, I argue, emerges in a mature form in the work of John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill, many of you probably know, is the quintessential liberal philosopher of the 19th century. What's less familiar is the fact that he identified as a socialist late in his life, particularly in his autobiography, partly under the influence of his wife, Harriet Taylor, right? And there's some debate about that. But the form of socialism that he endorsed was one that was not predicated on a command economy as we would understand it, but instead predicated on a transition to what we now understand to be worker cooperatives, right? So workers would own the means of production. He said that this would be a very useful step to take because in his book on socialism, he pointed out that really capitalists don't serve any meaningful function in the economy. They're mostly parasitic on what their workers are doing. So why not just have the workers directly run the firms? And then that would be accompanied, of course, by a very liberal state that is committed to fundamental personal liberties, but it would also engage in a wide array of redistributive activities. And he said, you take this all together, worker ownership of the means of production in a competitive marketplace with redistribution and a commitment to negative liberal liberties, and you'll get a kind of robust, free, solidaristic society that is recognizably liberal socialist. And then this tradition evolves, I argue, through the 20th century in a lot of different meaningful ways. But I've talked at great length right now, so I'll leave it to you.
I'm going to depart from my script.
Oh, I
briefly.
missed the Marx question. I'll talk
Yes.
about that later.
Maybe this anticipates that, which is, it seems to me that there's just about the liberal tradition briefly. It seems to me that there's a radical strain, arguably the most radical strain within liberalism, that wants to eschew moral arguments with respect to the obligations of property owners in favor of an argument about unsocial sociability or public vices transmuting into public virtues. This goes, of course, deeper into the 17th century, but is perhaps most famously advanced by Bernard Mandeville in The Fable of the Bees, so that we don't require the rich or the privileged to be good or to have any moral obligation, but in fact they're not parasites because they redistribute the surplus generated by society in a way and they're motivated to do so in a way that most conduces to both serving present needs and anticipating future needs, and thus the development of society. And so I guess I feel obliged to defend what you're calling the possessive individualist strain of liberalism as in fact at the core of the revolutionary impulse of bourgeois thought, which is to seek to advance a form of historical freedom, right, that goes beyond the obligations of all individuals, right, but rather maximizes the dynamism, the dynamic potential of that society. So how do you think about the Mandeville, Smith, emancipation or liberation of the third estate tradition that views property as an instrument of society as a whole?
Absolutely, right. So there are many different arguments that liberals and indeed libertarians have put forward to defend property rights. The first is a primarily moral argument that goes back all the way to Locke in many respects, which is predicated on this idea that property is a natural institution that in many ways precedes the state, which is always an uncomfortable thing to argue, but many libertarians will still try to argue for it, and that the entitlement to property is predicated again on one being rational and industrious and acquiring property through mixing one's labor with the matter of the universe in the more primitive version of the argument, or in its more contemporary kind of Nozickian form by engaging in reciprocally advantageous transactions with one another, through which one might accumulate more property without violating the fundamental rights of another person. So that's the moral argument that's been put forward to it. The other argument that in many respects is far more influential is the utilitarian argument for property rights that really kicks off, as you point out, in Mandeville, but I would argue assumes a kind of mature form in the writings of people like Jeremy Bentham, especially early utilitarians, right? So Jeremy Bentham, of course, puts forward this idea that seems on the surface of it to be an extraordinarily egalitarian idea, which is that each's account is one and no more than one, in the calculations of aggregative utility, right? And this has a kind of democratic quality to it as well, which is why Bentham, to his credit, right, supported things like universal suffrage, saying, look, if each person's account is one and no more than one, then everyone should have a say in the legislation that governs society. But when it came to his political economics, right, at a certain point, Bentham makes a choice between needing to defend the capitalist mode of production and moving in the more egalitarian, redistributive direction that his theory might seem to anticipate, with this idea that each's account is one and no more than one. And when faced with this choice, Bentham very clearly decides to come down on the side of capital, where he says, yes, one might be tempted to assume that utilitarianism is going to be committed to an egalitarian, redistributive ethic, because it matters as much that the poor flourish as the rich. But if we commit ourselves to this, then this is going to prove to be a barrier to the need for efficiency induced by capitalist incentives. So in the long run, what we need to do is commit ourselves to capitalism, right? And he was very draconian about this, as Elizabeth Anderson again points out in her new book, where he would say things like, the poor need to, in many senses, be disciplined to participate in the market economy, even if they don't want to. And if they fail to fulfill that duty, then we could even set up what he eerily characterized as work camps, right? Where they will go, they will receive hand-me-down clothes, they will all have the same shoes, and they will work tirelessly day in and day out in order to make a contribution to the economy if they aren't able to compete in the market system. And this is, of course, the basis of many people criticizing utilitarianism and its commitment to property rights over the course of the 19th century. Not just leftists, I should say, like Karl Marx, or for that matter, even another utilitarian like John Stuart Mill, but even reactionaries like Thomas Carlyle, who some of you might be familiar with, right? Thomas Carlyle, the man who famously said we should enslave the Irish and re-enslave, the people of the West Indies, also sat there and was like, Manchesterian capitalism and utilitarianism is too brutal, and we need to soften it, right? Which should really tell you something about the ethos of the time. So I think that this utilitarian argument for a commitment to property rights and capital is obviously the one that is more influential in the long run than this Lockean-style commitment to property rights as a matter of morality, although that's still very important, right? And I would argue that you see its highest expression in the work of somebody like F.A. Hayek, or in the middle of the 20th century, where he defends capitalism, yes, on the basis that it is necessary for freedom, but primarily on the basis that it is necessary for economic efficiency and the betterment of all over a long period of time. He famously described his philosophy as one committed to a kind of Kantian consequentialism, and I think that that's right.
Maybe this will bring you back around to the question of Marx, and Marx as a philosopher of his time, in the best sense of that, as a philosopher of the Industrial Revolution, or as he puts it, of capital, which is the question of, what are the stakes of this argument about property? It seems to me that Marx is arguing that capitalism is destructive of property, right? Both of the capitalists, or the owner of stock, as Adam Smith would put it, and in terms of the labor of the worker, right? That it creates monopoly, it produces inefficiencies in capital amongst capitalists, and it creates unemployment in the working class and job insecurity in the working class. And so in the famous second section of the Communist Manifesto, right, where it's the dialogue with the capitalists accuse the communists of wanting to abolish private property, and Marx and Engels' response is, no, capital is destroying private property, right? So that would seem to me to point not towards like a redistributionist socialism, but rather towards the critique of capitalism as what Marx calls mode of production, right? The actual critique of capitalism as a form of wealth production itself.
Yeah, and I mean, I can appreciate that. People sometimes ask me if I'm ever going to buy a house, and I say, the only piece of landed property I'm ever going to own is going to be my grave, and even that, I'll probably just rent it for a couple months, because that's all I'll be able to afford, right? Renting forever. But I think that Marx's critique of liberalism is something that, and liberal capitalism, is something that is internally worth returning to. So I just want to be clear here that my primary source of theoretical inspiration for what I'm about to say right now is the work of my good friend Igor Shuketbrod at Francis Xavier University, who wrote a wonderful book recently that came out with the title Revisiting Karl Marx's Critique of Liberalism, which makes the case for a more liberal reading of Marx that's in line with the one that I'm going to give here, right? So to your point about Marx's comments on property, right? I think that demonstrably a lot of what he says seems to be true. That at the origins of bourgeois ideology, that you still see occasionally fetishized now, is this idea that property under ideal circumstances will be widely distributed. And you can see this in things like not only the Lockean ideal, but even in the Jeffersonian ideal about the early United States, or for that matter, Abraham Lincoln's ideal about the early United States. That would be a fundamentally capitalist economy, but one that would primarily consist of small landowners, small businessmen, the kind of mom and pop stores that you will still see idealized in a lot of conservative and reactionary rhetoric. Prager University is a good example of this, right? Whenever they have a video that's critical of socialism, invariably it starts with, mom and dad own this flower shop, and, then the government comes and it taxes it to obliteration, and, we can't allow that, right? Why should the government get a say in what mom and pop want to do with their flower shop, right? And Marx points out, no, right? Under the conditions of capitalist competition, you're inevitably going to see private property become concentrated more and more in the hands of a few people. And this is going to generate enormous amounts of social deprivation and enormous amounts of social anger, right? And I think that we're seeing something very similar to that process occurring right now, right? Especially with neoliberalism's doubling down on the worst aspects of the capitalist mode of production since the 1980s, for example. And of course, the dialectical point that Marx continuously emphasized is this idea that the concentrations of property in the hands of a few capitalists is going to make the inevitable revolution that's going to occur far easier, because whereas earlier revolutionaries like liberals had to essentially completely reconstruct society from the ground up, all that the socialists initially are going to need to do is appropriate the monopolists that are at the top and then put them in the hands of the workers. So it would, in that sense, be a much more fluid kind of revolution than what occurred before. But on the point about what is going to come after that, my friend Igor points out, I think very correctly, that there has long been this kind of supposition on the part of socialists that socialism will constitute a radical break with the contours of bourgeois society and be fundamentally different from what we might call liberal democracy, right? And one of the things that Igor points out, drawing an enormous amount of textual evidence, is that Marx himself was very critical of this idea both in his early works all the way up to the critique of the Gotha program. In fact, he characterized it as almost a kind of a millenarian belief in revolution, to just undo everything that came before, and then bring about an entirely new society that never existed before. Marx's point is, how un-Hegelian, right? There's never a new society. There's a society that emerges, to use the language of the critique of the Gotha program, which emerges that is stamped by many of the features that appeared before, but is nonetheless more emancipatory, more equal, more efficient, and satisfying human needs. And my argument is that, in the book, I do not think that Marx would ever identify as a liberal socialist. I think that that's wrong, right? But I do think that there are elements of his work that suggest that we should not be as critical of the idea of a liberal socialism as some Marxists might want to be. And I would also argue that in a competition between what we might call orthodox Marxism and liberal socialism, it's not always clear to me that orthodox Marxism has a better answer to certain kind of problems than liberal socialism, right? The very clear example I can give of this, drawing upon Irving Howe, is Howe points out that in Marx's mature work, Post-Communist Manifesto, what you see expressed in things like his comments on the Paris Commune is the idea of a radically democratic society where there'd be high degrees of decentralization. Paris would essentially become a non-entity compared to these communes that would exist across France. They would all be self-regulating and with a certain amount of overlap in the National Assembly, and people who would be elected and then recalled pretty much at the whim of the populace, right? And Howe notes that there's this tremendous emphasis here on the importance of direct democratic legislative control of the sort that I think many leftists, myself included, will find very appealing. But Howe points out that this is a potentially dangerous kind of move to make because anybody, of course, who's familiar with the liberal tradition will recognize that allowing the legislature that much power, even if it is democratically accountable, without including respect for things like individual rights, potentially could lead to enormously damaging situations where, for instance, minorities could be victimized by majorities. I don't need to spell that out much more. So Howe's point is that rather than move towards this kind of radically democratic legislative society, what we should do is try to incorporate more democratic features into liberalism while recognizing the advantage that liberal theorists have had on recognizing the dangers of state power. And I think that there's a lot of good things to say about that.
I'm just going to ask one more question before I open it up. I think you're already beginning to anticipate this. One of the things that I appreciate about you, Matt, is the kind of openness with which you oppose historical orthodox Marxism. And I think you were anticipating that with your comments about Howe and how Howe understood Marx. You've also said that you count Edward Bernstein, and this would of course be the most notorious figure of historical debate, of historical controversy, to be a significant figure in the liberal socialist tradition, and that you reject Lenin and the Bolsheviks and really Orthodox Marxism more generally, or revolutionary Marxism more generally. One ground of that objection that I've heard you mention is their espousal of democratic centralism. Bernstein, in a sense, he's Irving Howe's teacher in this respect.
Absolutely.
Though Irving Howe is thinking in very different circumstances, and I think his political project's ultimately very different. Nevertheless, Bernstein attempted to revise Marx in light of changed historical conditions. And I wanted to ask, do you see your project anticipated in Bernstein in that way? That you think of your thought as, in a sense, an updating of socialism in light of new historical conditions, or do you find that Bernstein and kind of emerging, or for you, your own conception of a liberal socialist tradition as anticipating your thought in some other respect more fundamentally?
Yeah, it's a great question. So to the point about, do I see him as anticipating liberal socialism? I would say yes, but I would also say that in many senses, Edward Bernstein anticipates many of the flaws, or is characteristically flawed in the way that a lot of liberal socialist thinkers are. And this is where I argue at the conclusion of my book that to the extent that we want to retrieve liberal socialism, it can't be a kind of naive retrieval or hagiographic retrieval. It has to be a retrieval that recognizes that whatever good might be latent within liberal socialism, it was a political tradition that failed, ultimately, to curb the power of neoliberalism. And I think one of the reasons that it failed is that it abandoned too many key Marxist lessons about the power of capitalism as a global totality, with this fixation on the idea that reformist nation-statism would be sufficient to bring about a process or a movement towards something like democratic socialism. So my own version of liberal socialism would be a lot more Marxist-inflected than Bernstein's would. Now, on the point of whether or not he specifically has something of value to teach us, I think that Bernstein's reputation has been very understandably negative as a result of the frankly, betrayal of the SPD of people like Rosa Luxemburg, right, during the German Revolution, which stamped reformism with this idea of being a kind of collaborative doctrine with fascism. To be clear, Bernstein himself was not, in favor of militaristically suppressing the left wing of German socialism, right? He tended to be wary of making this kind of staunch commitments. And he died in 1932, horrified by things like the arrival of Nazism and deeply concerned about what it bode for the future. In terms of what I think that he contributes to the liberal socialist tradition that is worth taking away in his book, The Preconditions of Socialism, I think that there are two key things. The first is that Bernstein, I think, fundamentally misreads Marx as a mechanistic or deterministic thinker and is critical of him in that respect, which is also true, I should say, of another important liberal socialist and anti-fascist called Carlos Rosselli, who in his book Liberal Socialism chastises the kind of mechanistic versions of Marxism that he saw as being prevalent in Italy. Now, I do not think that Marx is actually a mechanistic thinker. I think that's a misreading of Marx and Marxism, right? But there is no denying that a certain kind of
How do you mean mechanistic? Just spell out, like, how did they understand, like historical determinist or teleological, or how do you mean mechanistic?
Oh, that's right. The teleological dimension is the one that he thought was more problematic, right? The idea that giving changing historical circumstances, in the long run, the victory of socialism was inevitable, as long as there was a sufficiently powerful revolutionary party to take advantage of changing conditions when the kind of moment arose, right? Bernstein is very critical of that by saying, look, human societies are invariably too complex to assume that there's some kind of teleological direction in which history is moving. And I do think that history has borne that out, right? Now, again, I do not think that Marx himself is a teleological thinker or is committed to this mechanistic view of history. But there's no doubt, again, that it was a popular flavor of Marxism that warranted critique at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, and I still think deserves critique whenever it appears. And this leads me to the second thing that I think Bernstein contributes to liberal socialism that is of tremendous importance, which is his argument that fundamentally there is nothing in socialist thought that you cannot also find in liberalism and vice versa. This is a key point that he makes in The Preconditions of Socialism. Now, he's aware that this is a very controversial statement to make, but he says, look, fundamentally at the origins of bourgeois thought is this idea of establishing a revolutionary state that is committed to the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. That is, of course, very similar to the objectives of socialists, if you were to press them hard enough on the kind of principles that they are committed to. So the goal, according to Bernstein, should not be to abandon liberalism or break with liberalism, but instead adopt a dialectical attitude towards it and try to push the latent tendencies within liberalism to radicalism to their natural conclusion. And I think this is the proper way to understand his famous or infamous phrase that ultimately the movement is everything, the end is nothing. Because if you're so fixated on the end of achieving socialism that you don't actually take steps to build socialism and a socialism that works in communities, then you're probably never going to get there and get there in the long run anyway, right? Because fundamentally, I think that making the case for socialism to the working class or to the subaltern means demonstrating as quickly as possible that socialism will work to make their lives palatably better. And that's the kind of thing that I think DSA, for example, at its best does. Or Bernie.
Thanks, Matt. I could think of a lot of questions, but I know that a lot of you can too. How long do we have in this room? Till we have another hour. Can someone please, Tomas, would you do that? Would you handle the microphone or somebody?
Most importantly, would somebody mind giving me a cigarette at the end of this?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do
So
that.
crucial. Okay, thank you.
Can you call on people though?
Sure. How about Athene right here?
Hi, thank you for this, Matt. I had a question regarding how you kind of make sense of the development of capitalism, particularly through your kind of interpretation of the trajectory of liberal thinkers. In particular, you talk about, Mandeville as this kind of owner liberal that would later kind of be matured upon by Bentham. And I guess I have a question about whether or not you see there being a qualitative historical difference between Bentham and Mandeville or Kant, for instance. This distinction between an age of enlightenment versus an enlightened age, unsocial sociability,
Right.
necessitating the liberal state, but also at some level being the basis for freedom as expressed through, wealth or private property that could come, into being in the social sphere. And, I guess in this notion that you raise in Jeremy Bentham that each would count as one, this seems like a very egalitarian notion, as you pointed out. And so, how then could this be used to justify, capitalism to some extent, unless there was, at some level, a historical development precisely within the way property enters into relationship with each other that perhaps has come into crisis by the time these different, liberal thinkers, as you phrase them, come into the scene. So I guess using your readings, how do you trace the development of capitalism? Do you think that it was always capitalist from Kant, Mandeville, Smith, or, yeah?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So I think there are two levels that we need to distinguish here, right? One is, of course, the material level, where capitalism as a distinctive mode of production was actually emerging on the ground. And then, of course, there is the reification of the relations of the capitalist mode of production in the thinking of major liberal theorists and political theorists, right? And then, of course, the third thing that we need to talk about is the relation between this material level and the ideational level, which I do not think in any way is just unicausal, right? And the sense that the one determines the other. It's more complicated than that. So in terms of why Bentham transitioned away from what seems to be the latent egalitarianism of his theory, I'm not really sure that I can give you a solid answer to that, in part because I think there are many different reasons that he did this, right? I think that part and parcel of it is, of course, he was profoundly influenced by the emerging capitalist mode of production that was gaining steam at the time, and he was deeply wary of the kind of French revolutions and sympathetic revolutions that were breaking out in Europe, and he felt that the proper way to try to pursue equality wasn't through democratizing society in this very deep way, let alone democratizing the economy, but instead through allowing market mechanisms to induce efficiencies that will allow goods to be redistributed in such a way that human needs will be satisfied. And in the event that this meant that some people were consequently required to be poor for a given period of time, well, utilitarianism has a justification for that, right? The aim is not to produce the greatest happiness for everyone, but the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And if some people need to be poor in order to allow markets to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number in the long or the medium run, then that's fine, right? And again, he proposed a number of different policies over the course of his life that induced me to think that this is probably the appropriate way to understand his thinking. The most pernicious example is the one that I already gave, right, about the establishment of these workhouses, right, where if the poor were not able to cut it in an emerging market economy, then they would be sent there because the state still had some obligations to look after them, right? But it was very minimal, and it was predicated on them making a worthwhile contribution to the economy. And I mean, I don't need to tell you about all the kind of Foucauldian connotations that emerge from living in a Benthamite workhouse, everyone wearing the same clothes, eating the same food day in and day out, right? Sorry, yeah, we'll get that afterwards. In terms of the Kant connection, right, I think it's important here that we distinguish between two very different kinds of liberalism that would be important for somebody like Marx and Marxism, right? Marx is very clear over the course of his life that the primary flavor of bourgeois ideology that he was critical of was, of course, utilitarianism, which he associates with various kinds of vulgar economics, but also the kind of more pronouncedly impressive figures that emerge in the 19th century, people like, say, David Ricardo, for example. Kant is a very different kind of animal in this respect, since Kant, of course, belonged to a German tradition, which would eventually lead to Hegel and then, of course, Marx himself. And I think that what Kant captures very successfully in his work is an idea, for all the way that he understood this in a reactionary manner, that is central to socialism, and indeed any kind of radical political ideology, which is a recognition that the forms that the social world assume are not to be naturalized or reified in any way that calcifies them in their place, which I take to be central to his critique of things like heteronomy, for example. Kant is very insistent that the social world is the creation of human beings, and to the extent it is naturalized or taken to be natural, this is actually an abnegation of our moral responsibility to be the creators of the social world that we want to inhabit, and in this case, a world that he thinks is ultimately going to take Republican form. Now, of course, later on in Hegel, this is going to assume a much more refined and historicist kind of flavor when he argues for this idea that the best kind of society will be one where people are capable of self-determination, but not purely as individuals in a Republican system, but in terms of constituting their shared ethical life. And then we all know where Marx is going to go with this from there, right? And I would argue at the end of Marx, in Capital Volume 3, is fundamentally a commitment to a similar kind of idea, where he says at the conclusion of Capital Volume 3 that in history up until this point, the development of human powers has primarily been based upon this idea of mobilizing human powers in the service of the predominant mode of production at any given time. In this case, mobilizing human powers for the purposes of producing surplus value that can then be expropriated by capital and then revalorized. Whereas in socialism, the development of human powers will, as he puts it, be an end in and of itself for the first time, which very clearly has, again, a kind of Kantian quality to it, and this idea that we are going to be self-determining for the first time, but of course with all this kind of Hegelian, Aristotelian flavoring added to it by centering the fact that self-determination or being free is not just about being a transcendental being capable of rational thought, but also having a material and social setting that enables us to exercise our freedom in a more meaningful kind of way.
I think if you have a follow-up, please keep it short. There's a lot of other hands.
Sorry, just very quickly. Well, I mean, just to that point, though, I think that latent within Mandeville and Smith is that this private ownership society where private vice is public good, that the ultimate ends of that is everyone's capacity to self-determine themselves in society. So how then is there a heritage between that line of thought to Bentham, where it's not about public freedom, but about utility or happiness?
Sure. Well, I want to be clear. I think that Smith is a remarkably complicated thinker, and there are many different dimensions to his thought, which is why he's perennially reread. And I think that of all the bourgeois economists, it's very clear that Marx has the most respect for Adam Smith. The only possible competitor I can think of is David Ricardo, right, who's sometimes nicer to, sometimes meaner to, depending on Marx's mood, right? But Adam Smith, right, I think it's important to understand, is not strictly Mandevillian in the sense that he thinks that private vice is always going to be public virtue, right? I think that that is a popularization of Adam Smith that starts to emerge with somebody like F.A. Hayek that distorts the more anthropologically correct set of views that are present in both of Smith's two mature works, right? So take his theory of moral sentiments, right? In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith purports to this idea that seems quite Marxist in some respects, that primarily, right, what we are engaged in as human beings is the cultivation of our powers and the refinement of our sensibilities. And he points out that one of the primary ways that this has been distorted, particularly in the modern era, is through reverence for the rich, right, where he actually says expressly in Theory of Moral Sentiments, nothing has done more to distort our moral sentiments than this reverence for wealth that is so ubiquitous in 18th century society. Now, there are some people who have said, well, yes, he said that in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, but what about the wealth of nations, right? I would argue, following Martha Nussbaum, if you read the Wealth of Nations carefully, what you see is that Smith is even more critical of the adulation of wealth that is present in his society. Actually, I got into a debate about this just the other day on Twitter, talking about minimum wage laws in California, right? One of the points that Smith makes is that in the 18th century, capitalists will continuously complain about the effects of wage increases on eating into profits. But on their own gain, they are completely silent, as he puts it, because they're supposed to gain, right? Whereas the workers are not. And Smith says this is an irrevocably major problem in any kind of market system that's established, because of course the rich are going to adopt these kind of attitudes, and they're going to hemorrhage their power to try to ensure that they're the ones that profit, not the workers. And he called for the state to intervene in a wide variety of different ways to try to compensate for these tendencies that he saw as being latent within market society. Now, there are more left and more right-wing ways to understand this. I tend to think that Smith was more progressive than he's usually been given credit for, but I'll just leave it there. But that's where I'd say he differs also from the Benthamite position.
Richard.
Yes. So you mentioned you thought was the misreading of Marx as mechanical and teleological.
By Bernstein, yeah.
Right, so the first question would be, it seems to me those are two separate things that are not necessarily correlated. And then the second question would be, why should one reject either a mechanical or a teleological claim? In other words, what's bad about either or both of those? Mm-hmm. And just because they're false? And then the other question is, what would you say to the conservative criticism of socialism, that the problem with socialism is that by suppressing property rights, it ends up suppressing freedom in general? That property rights are inherent to modern freedom, and that the unfortunate experience of Stalinist societies demonstrates that the attempt to suppress property rights leads to an unfree society.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So to your first question, Bernstein was very critical of the kind of teleological dispositions that he saw as being latent within orthodox Marxism, because he felt this idea that there was going to be an inevitable socialist or communist revolution that would bring about a society where the free development of each would be a precondition for the free development of all, just didn't seem to be borne out by history, right? And I think that time has vindicated that view, right? That the idea that there's some kind of telos of history that we're all moving towards, even if it happens to seem appealing, it's just not there, right? And I think that there is a problem with sacrificing this view when it comes to leftist rhetoric, because it's a very powerful view, right? For a long time, even pro-capitalist economists like Arthur Schuppener would say things like, look, the victory of socialism is inevitable. Marx seems to have proven this, and what a shame, right? It's going to be such a boring society, and we should hope to postpone that as long as possible, right? But, we are no longer in the 1930s, and I just don't think it is viable to argue that the victory of socialism is inevitable, teleologically, right? In terms of the kind of critique of Marxism as mechanistic, I absolutely agree with you, right, that this can be distinguished from the kind of teleological implications that some orthodox Marxists give to it, and it can be just understood as a way of trying to rationally understand how it is that societies go through various different historical processes, with an emphasis being, of course, on the material relations that are necessary for reproducing their social life. And this comes in a wide variety of different flavors, including some that I admire, right? Probably the two most important Marxists for my own thinking in the latter half of the 20th century were Mandel and G.A. Cohen, right? Not necessarily the G.A. Cohen of the 1990s who emphasized the ethical importance of socialism, although I think that's a good Cohen also, but the Cohen of Karl Marx's theory of history that emphasized how Marx offers us a very useful analytical lens to understand how the technological changes wrought by economic transitions have fundamentally reshaped human societies in ways that almost no one could have anticipated beforehand. Sometimes this is called technological determinism, which I think is unfair to Cohen, but that's neither here nor there. Or you could take someone like Mandel, right, with this idea of a transition to late capitalism. He was often criticized for having a kind of mechanistic view of Marxism as well, but I think that what he really emphasizes is how difficult it is to understand the transition from a more classical night watchman state to the welfare state, unless you understand why it is that it was necessary to counteract the rising power of workers through the establishment of these kinds of welfare mechanisms that were intended to blunt the revolutionary energies of socialism by essentially incorporating them into a state system where they could be pacified, right? So these kinds of more mechanistic views of Marxism, I still have a lot, I think have a lot going for them. Where I would be cautious about endorsing a purely mechanistic view of Marxism is any kind of version of Marxism that denies an important role for human agency, which is, again, also part of Bernstein's critique, right? Because he points out how many orthodox Marxists prior to the transition to the Weimar Republic, would say things like, again, the victory of socialism is inevitable. There's nothing that either the capitalists can do to stop it. And Bernstein said, well, then what should we be doing to bring this about, right? If this is inevitable given the transition that the historical dialectic is taking, why should we form socialist parties? Why should we engage in activism? And he pointed out, and I think Rosselli points this out as well, that many orthodox Marxists didn't have a very convincing answer to that, beyond just saying, well, there needs to be a party in place for when the moment becomes right so that they can take advantage of that, right? So I think that my version of Marxism, even if it can draw very heavily upon more mechanistic and more deterministic iterations, will always require a staunch place for human agency at its very core. And indeed, I think that that is vital to the normative appeal of Marxism as well. Again, this idea being that socialism should aspire to a society where the development of human powers becomes an element, an end in itself for the first time.
Stefan, is the microphone still there?
Thank you. I want to try to tie some points together. In your answer, please correct me if I misunderstood something. So what I gathered is that in a certain way, socialism and liberalism both wanted to have like a liberated society, so a society which is neither mainly driven by domination over people nor by a struggle for survival. And then you also brought up Bernstein, and Bernstein was famous for this quote, right, like, the goal means nothing to me, but the movement means everything. And I think, right, like when we're talking about the goal, when Bernstein is talking about the goal, he's not talking about like this utopian future, which both liberalism and socialism refer to, but the orthodox Marxist idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Which is like an international idea. As far as I know, Bernstein was not against revolutions in authoritarian states, right? But he rejected this idea of the need for an international revolution. And so Marxism was sometimes also called proletarian socialism. So my question would be, what's the reason to call it liberal socialism and not social liberalism? Is this a mere tactical question which arises out of the constellation of society right now? Or is there something else which makes it necessary for you to speak about liberal socialism instead of imagining it as a social liberalism?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to divide it into two, just because I think the second one deserves a little bit more attention, right? On the exegetical point about Bernstein, right? You're absolutely right that he was not opposed to revolutionary agitation against authoritarian states, right? If anything, he kept that option open to him throughout the course of his life, right? What he was opposed to was this idea that socialists should be just fixated on the end of achieving a utopian classless society. In no small part, and this relates back to my comment about agency, because he said that is never going to come about unless you are able to meaningfully convince the working class as it exists right now that socialism can make their life tangibly better, right? And I think that's an important lesson for all socialists to understand, right? If you continually postpone or project into the future people's expectations and say 10, 20 years from now, when the revolution occurs, everything will get better, or your great-grandchildren will get to benefit from the socialism that's going to emerge then, you can't be that surprised when many people will say, well, I have problems right here and now, so I'm going to vest my hopes in other political ideologies. Thank you very much. What Bernstein was talking about were the efforts made by the SPD at the time to try to offer things like bars or unions or community centers, right, where people could go, they could take advantage of the different programs that were offered there, and so they could think to themselves, day in and day out, the socialists are making my life tangibly better in this kind of way. And he saw that as absolutely vital to achieving success. Now, I think that there are limitations to this process as well. We don't want socialism to just become about building community centers for people to go and have a beer and not bowl alone anymore, right? But it is vital, right? Because if you think about anybody who's engaged in practical political agitation, right? When you knock on a door, you want to be able to say, like, if you vote for our party, 4 years from now, this is how we're going to make things better off for you, right? I think that's very, very important. On the kind of broader point that you made about why liberal socialism and not social liberalism, the two are analytically distinct traditions, right? And there's a liminal space between them in the sense that, of course, if you move far enough to the left in your social liberalism, you will probably eventually arrive at liberal socialism, right? But I think that the author who has provided the most concrete exposition of this distinction is Michael Walzer, a problematic thinker in a lot of different ways, but in his recent book, Liberalism, he pointed out that what distinguishes liberal socialists from social liberals is they are more committed to equality than social liberals. And I would add on to that social liberalism of the sort that we would associate with, say, welfarism, is predominantly being committed to this idea that very high levels of inequality can persist in society so long as, broadly speaking, the economy runs in an efficient enough way that we can take some of the surplus that is produced and then direct that back through the provision of welfare programs that will benefit everybody, and particularly the working classes, right? Now, I think this would certainly be preferable to neoliberalism, but it certainly is not socialism in the sense that what we are doing is democratizing the economy in any kind of meaningful way. What distinguishes liberal socialism from social liberalism is this idea that central to liberal socialism will have to be this commitment to economic democracy, in particular the idea that workers will be in charge of the means of production rather than the state or certainly, of course, the capitalist class. Now, different liberal socialist thinkers understood this in a wide variety of different ways, right? So John Stuart Mill, as I mentioned, right, was fundamentally committed to a kind of cooperativist market socialism that many people might find problematic or not, where he said, ultimately what we're going to do is get rid of the capitalist class. Workers will take control of firms directly in the way, say, Mondragon is a cooperative. And there will still be competition because market mechanisms of competition are necessary to induce efficiency. But the workers will be able to redistribute any profits they have directly back to the workers without the capitalists intervening. And then, of course, we accompany that with other kind of welfare mechanisms. John Rawls, who I also talk about quite extensively in my book, was committed to a similar kind of idea when he talked about liberal socialism, where he said, look, there's no reason why it is that we cannot extend liberal principles of democratic self-management and fundamental rights into the economy. If anything, it is only due to bourgeois prejudices of the sort that Marx revealed that we have not undertaken this step thus far. And Rawls was enormously laudatory of Marx, right, where he called him fundamentally a heroic figure who profoundly influenced his theory of justice and committed himself, and he argued, even though much of Marx's reputation was damaged by the failure of command economies, this is no reason to assume that liberal socialism would be subject to similar kinds of failures, and it could carry on in this very Marxist spirit, okay, albeit, of course, with many corrections. As for his lectures on political philosophy.
Over here.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. You talked about your political consciousness coming of age in an opportune time around the Jacobin milieu, which you characterize as having a sort of intellectual openness about it. So I was wondering what you saw that as a response to. What was the sort of intellectual closed-mindedness or dogmatization that Jacobin might have been a response to? Similarly, would you characterize the DSA by such an intellectual or political openness? And what you saw the legacy of that intellectual openness today? Is there still that sort of commitment to big tentism on the left? If not, where do you see it breaking down?
Yeah, That's a very moving question. So I don't want to get too autobiographical because, as my mom would tell me, there's nothing more boring than listening to someone talk about themselves over and over and over again, right? But just very briefly, right? Anybody who's read Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism, will kind of have a good sense for what it was like to grow up in the 1990s and the early 2000s, right? There is this pervasive sense that history was foreclosed, that there was no alternative to neoliberalism, that the best you could do if you wanted to be a leftist was Tony Blair, and that's what you had to settle for, right? And that was the atmosphere in which I was brought up. Now, the Iraq War troubled that in the sense that you started the first intimations of resistance to this idea that the world would just carry on the way it was. But it didn't really challenge the economic base of American imperialism or other forms of imperialism, at least, when I was 14, 15 years old, right, when we were mostly just opposed to the war for political reasons. What happened when I started to read things like Jacobin, or for that matter, Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism, was the realization that many people in my generation were profoundly dissatisfied with this end of history period and wanted something better, and that socialism still had the power to appeal to people with offering this prospect of a better world, right? Now, I think there are problems, again, with what's now been called millennial socialism, right? In the sense that, we failed to get Bernie Sanders elected, and we failed to get Corbyn elected, and a lot of other things, right? But I do still have a certain sympathy to this spirit of breaking away from the straitjacket in which the dominant ideologies of the time tried to impose us, right? Tried to impose upon us. And in terms of how this relates back to my appreciation for a kind of ecumenical leftism, I suppose that's part of the reason why I identify as a liberal socialist as well, right? In the sense that to be a liberal-minded person is always associated with this idea of finding joy in people's individual differences and seeing these not as the barrier to a flourishing society or even as something that we just need to tolerate in order to achieve a flourishing society, but as characteristic of a flourishing society. And I really enjoy a lot of the internecine debates, spats that emerged on the left because I see them as a sign of intellectual health, that we are capable of disagreeing with one another in sometimes a very pronounced way while still remaining committed to this ideal of achieving socialist justice, right? So I wouldn't want to do away with this kind of the different factions that appear on the left by trying to impose some homogenous unanimity on it. I think that would really be an enormously bad thing to achieve.
Can I just borrow the mic?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I was somewhat intimating this in my question to you about where I started off by talking about how I appreciate your openness, because it's not always there, right? And I guess I would want to add to this young man's question, how has dogmatism, maybe sectarianism, how has it been transformed and in some ways worsened? I know that we have lots of friends, comrades on the left, who will secretly tell me, well, I can't talk to you, I don't know, they might say this to you, but they'll say it to me. I can't talk to you in public, right? Because then I won't be able to get my book published here or there, right? And it's very unclear, like, what the line that they are supposed to follow is, and why talking to me breaks that line. And it seems, in that sense, much murkier, and in that ways much more authoritarian in some ways, even as a response to, undoubtedly, a very ossified environment on the left.
Yeah, I think actually my friend Ben Burgess talked about this, I think most successfully in his book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, where he points out that since the 1980s, there has been a deeply melancholic dimension to a lot of left-wing activism in the sense that many on the left, right, feel profoundly like it is morally important to try to agitate for a better society, but the forces that oppose us are just so ubiquitous and so powerful that it is almost impossible for actually to us achieve our goals of building a better society. And one of the things that Ben points out in his book, and I think Wendy Brown points this out also in her work on left-wing melancholy, is the kind of personality that induces is somebody who is committed to a kind of morally puritanical attitude in compensation for the aspiration to actually achieve the goals that they set for themselves. Because you can sit there and say, I am never going to actually be able to achieve the society that I want to achieve, but I can always know that I'm more righteous than everybody else that happens to fall in my faction, right? And I can be discerning about who I associate with because there's no point in banding together because it's not like we're going to win anyway, right? Now, I can empathize with a lot of those feelings. I really can, right? Because there have been more moments that I can count where I've thought to myself that, especially post-2016, the world is just going to hell in a handbasket, and the best thing for me to do is kind of return to my inner Catholic and engage in metaphysical speculation and ignore the world and dissociate from anybody that I don't like. But I think that is an unhelpful and unhealthy impulse on my part, right? Because I do think that it is important to recognize that the world is fundamentally a very plastic thing, and it is possible for the left to succeed. But we are only going to succeed if we are able to accept and even welcome our differences while putting them aside for the larger goal of trying to overcome the extraordinarily reactionary, pernicious, and toxic kind of ethic and system that has been produced by neoliberalism, including its most vulgar intimations like Trumpism, Orbanism, etc.
I wanted to, when I was educated into Marxism a long, long time ago, both people who were on the right and on the left who were educated me sort of highlighted a tension between liberalism and Marxism, in which the liberalism saw the emancipatory subject as being the individual, and therefore emancipation basically involved affirming individual legal rights. And Marxism, starting with on the Jewish question, saw emancipation as being a social and involving a social subject. And so you have Lukács sort of talking about emancipation of the proletariat as a subject, and that would be a real tension. I'm not saying that it's not dialectically resolvable or something like that, but it is nevertheless a real tension between liberalism and Marxism, if it was true.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up because I was wondering when that question would appear. So this is a good place as any for me to make a shameless plug for Lukács's great book, The Destruction of Reason. Some of you might know I spent an awful lot of time talking about the political right and equality, and Lukács's The Destruction of Reason is enjoying a well-deserved comeback in trying to understand phenomena like Malonism, Trumpism, etc. So if you get a chance, go read it. It's 900 pages, so it's not a small read, but boy, oh boy, is it electrifying, right? So that's just me sharing my own excitement about the resurgence of this book with you. In terms of this distinction between focusing on individual flourishing and collective emancipation, I think that there is no doubt a lot of truth to this, right? In the sense that classical liberalism's social ontology, well into the 19th century, was fundamentally atomistically committed to a notion of individual flourishing, where individuals were perceived as having certain pre-social rights and owing nothing to anyone around them, in fact needing to be left alone by other people around them. And Marxism, of course, was extremely critical of that, not just for political reasons, but I would like to point out because Marx just pointed out that seems untrue, that we are inherently, as Aristotle would say, social animals, and trying to understand us as pre-social atomistic individuals just does a disservice to anthropology. And I think that he's correct about that, right? Now, saying this, I think that liberal socialism answers this through its commitment to what I take to be what I call its three core principles. The first of these core principles, as I put it, is a commitment to a methodologically collectivist social ontology, while at the same time retaining a commitment to what I call normative individualism. And what this means is that liberal socialists in the vein of John Stuart Mill or John Rawls, the two Johns as I've taken to call them, or Chantal Mouffe, are not only accepting, but double down on this idea that we are fundamentally social animals, and that it is only within the right social settings that we are fully able to express our freedom and to form meaningful relations with other people. However, all liberal socialists are also committed to the idea that from the point of moral theory, it is still individual flourishing that we have reason to be concerned with, not the abstract flourishing of entities like, say, the nation or the state or the people, since, of course, these are just kind of reified notions that we project onto social reality. They aren't real material things the way that actual human individuals are, right? Now, all liberal socialist thinkers, as I point out...
What about the freedom of society?
The freedom of society? Oh, okay. Actually, this relates back to an earlier question that was brought up here. So this relates back to the third principle that I argue liberal socialists are committed to, which is this idea that classical liberalism made a mistake in assuming that the only meaningful kind of freedom that people should enjoy is what's sometimes called negative freedom. The idea that primarily what we are trying to do on this earth here is be an individual gathering as much stuff as we possibly can. Liberal socialists are committed to the idea, and this is Axel Honneth's point, that another very important form of freedom is what we might call social freedom, the ability to have a say with others in the institutions that govern us, and in the most maximalist sense, to see ourselves and our collective species being reflected in them. Now, this is an idea that has, of course, deeper roots, even in the socialist tradition, going all the way back to republicanism, and I would even argue direct democracy in antiquity. And there's a lot of work that's being done by people like Smith and Honneth, both liberal socialist thinkers, I argue, in trying to resurrect this idea for a kind of democratically minded left, right, that is committed to social freedom. But that's where I think you would see this dimension become very, very important in the liberal socialist tradition.
We've still got 23 minutes, so plenty of time for questions. Did you have your hand up?
I also have my hand up.
Go ahead and ask your question.
He handed us the mic, so you should get the prerogative, right?
There's no point in resisting.
Thank you. No, thank you for your talk. I wanted to point out two things that you brought up. One was the transformation from what you call this night watchman state to, I don't remember the exact word, but basically a state that was more involved in maybe the economy or society. Maybe you can clarify that. I'm
Sure.
not sure what the difference would be. And then, sorry, I lost my train of thought. The other one was whether capitalists were parasites, so this idea of them being superfluous. And I was just trying to think of like which historical moment this would be valid in, because my understanding is we were talking about the kind of revolutionary phase of liberal Enlightenment thought. This distinction between capitalists and workers might have not made sense, right? So we brought up Mandeville, for example, the third estate, that kind of breaks down into the workers and capital. And then there's a specific moment in which it would be a political demand to say the capitalists are superfluous, and it presupposes, one could say, the self-organization of the working class in order to kind of affect that, right? And actually my question is about whether that we still live in that same moment. Has that changed? Is that, given that today, in one sense, we've had the workers integrated into state management and management of the economy, but it also seems to have not had the sort of self-organization or the kind of political control of society that Marxism might have once presupposed would be the result of the workers taking responsibility for society. And so my question, I guess, to put it in a polemical way, is like, could we still say that capitalists are superfluous? Could the left make such a claim today?
Okay, so I'll break this down into two, right? First off, again, one of the things that everybody post-Polanyi and Marx will point out is that there's this projection on the part of many classical liberals of a kind of idyllic time back to the 19th century that they characterize as the night watchman era, where the idea is that fundamentally the state had very little involvement in individuals' lives, and it certainly had no kind of involvement in the market. It more or less left people alone to their business, and then this induced what is sometimes taken to be the upswing in economic efficiency that brought about higher qualities of life in the 20th and 21st century, right? Now, this idea is a fantasy, right? Again, anybody who is even reasonably attentive to history will point out that it was absolutely necessary for the state to be heavily involved in early processes of capital mobilization and indeed imperial expansion, right, to spread capitalism around the globe. And this was often very directly called for by many emerging capitalists because they saw it as necessary for the extraction of profit, right? Now, after the night watchman state, so-called, right, what you sometimes see is the emergence of the welfarist model, is the term that I use, starting in the 1930s, but really kicking into high gear in the 1950s, which is still an object of enormous reverence on the center left especially. The idea being that through a combination of Keynesian economics, redistributive programs, and high levels of unionization, what we were able to do was retain capitalism, right, but spread its benefits more evenly in a way that was conducive to the benefits of all, right? Now, without a doubt, right, I think this was a step forward from 19th century capitalism with the gloves off, if you want to call it that. But I think that it failed for very clear reasons. And the most important of these was the failure to sufficiently take this moment to democratize the economy and ensure that the power of capital was sufficiently blunted so that capital wouldn't be able to launch a kind of counter-revolution against this transition to welfarism. And this is, of course, exactly what ended up happening, starting, I would argue, in 1968 with the election of Richard Nixon, and then really kicking into high gear with the election of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, right, where what you saw were the minimal but still real achievements of welfarism roll back systematically all over the place. And more problematically still, what you saw was an awareness on the part of the major liberal ideologues that the night watchman state that had previously been fetishized was just that, a fantasy, and that they were not going to try to return to that. F.A. Hayek was probably the most express about this, where he said, laissez-faire is not a liberal or a capitalist idea. Laissez-faire is an anarchist idea. Anybody with any kind of attention would recognize that capital requires the state, and the state needs to be highly involved in establishing the conditions that are necessary for a market society. And indeed, F.A. Hayek said, even the state in the late 20th century is insufficient. What we need to do is mobilize and develop international institutions that will make the world safe for capital by encasing or insulating it from democratic pressures of the sort that we saw emerging from the 1930s onwards. And I think we're still very much living in that moment, although I'm hoping that we're at the tail end of it, right? Fingers crossed. Who knows, right? In terms of your second question about how do we enact a transition towards economic democracy in a way that would be compatible with something like liberal socialism, I think there are a number of different practical programs that have been proposed, right? Probably the two that are most plausible, to my mind, will be following Elizabeth Anderson in, again, advocating for a more cooperativist focus in the economy, where capitalists were largely expropriated, and we would institute democratic practices, at least in the largest firms in the United States and many other places. Now, this would need to be accompanied by legal mechanisms to ensure that this transition was carried out in a way that made it immutable. So again, there couldn't be a kind of counter-revolutionary push against this transition to cooperativism. But it's certainly not something that is implausible when you think that the model is already there in things like, say, the Mondragon Corps. We just need to instantiate it more broadly. Another thing that many have put forward as a plausible way of transitioning to socialism would be following in the more radical vein of Swedish social democracy in the 1970s by enacting something like the Meidner Plan that some of you might be familiar with, right? So Olof Palme, who was the leader of Sweden and the Swedish Social Democratic Party at the time, famously declared that we have done more to move Sweden towards socialism than any of the so-called socialist countries, right? Which was a bold claim to make in the 1960s, not necessarily the 1970s, because what the Meidner Plan put forward was this idea that the workers in companies would gradually assume shares in the companies they worked at. These would be managed by their unions, which would be extraordinarily powerful, and over a relatively medium-term period of time, gradually the unions would become the majority shareholders in the company, which would effectively make the workers the owners of the company. Now, unfortunately, this idea in its most robust forms was not put in place because the Swedish Social Democratic Party fell in no small part because it wasn't environmentally committed enough to denuclearization, right? And then when a kind of version of this idea was floated in the 1980s, wasn't nearly as ambitious, right? But I follow Bhaskar Sukkara, right, in thinking that this is definitely a plausible way of going about putting the means of production in the hands of workers through legislative initiatives, in this case, establishing, the Meidner Plan, without necessarily needing to enact a revolutionary break with societies that exist now, because we could transition to this over a period of, say, 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, depending on context.
Questions? Over here, Pam. Get to you.
Thank you. You raised Domenico Lasordo earlier in your talk,
Yep.
and I wanted to return something that the first question Athena had raised and was trying to specify how you think about capitalism. So it seems like for Lasordo, you've got throughout the entire human history this tradition of emancipation alongside de-emancipation, and that for him, emancipation is some kind of radical equality, which is constantly being undermined. So that capitalism is just one instance of this, right? Rather than a historically specific problem of freedom and unfreedom, which is how Marx discussed it as a kind of crisis of both liberalism and democracy in the mid-19th century. And so maybe just as a way of fleshing that out, since some of the names that you raised, like Adam Smith, right? Like that Adam Smith's condition for universal opulence had been degraded to the point that for Louis Blanc, the state had to step in to guarantee full employment. Right, so that's certainly a different role for the state, and you could argue, as Marx did, that that means the conditions under which society could become free in the way that Smith had originally imagined had fundamentally transformed. So, okay, so is it the case when you said earlier you characterized it as a socialist justice, and it seems like you do have a sense of a radical equality? How is the political imagination of Marx trying to specify the problem of capitalism? Or do you agree with Lasordo that capitalism is just one instance of a kind of unfreedom or de-emancipation of that radical equality?
Oh, I absolutely agree with Lasordo on this point, right? So Lasordo's Liberalism, A Counter-History is a magisterial book that performs a very important function, right? Which is to reveal the very dark and often under-theorized and undiscussed, like seamy history of liberalism, including at the level of theory, right? Now, I want to be clear, right, that if you read this book carefully, Lasordo also is very transparent about the fact that this is not intended to be a rejection of liberalism. In fact, at the conclusion of the book, he says, liberalism's merits are so obvious that we don't even need to discuss them here, right? Because everybody should be familiar with them at this point. But having merits does not also mean that one does not possess demerits. And that's what's going to be foregrounded in this book, precisely because there are so many hagiographies of liberalism out there that exclusively discuss the merits, right? And I think that that's the appropriate tack to take. In terms of this discussion about the relationship between equality and freedom in Lasordo's work and in the broader Marxist tradition, right? I think that it is extremely important to emphasize that any left conception of freedom invariably is going to have an extraordinarily egalitarian element to it. And this is precisely because there are many reactionary flavors of freedom that do make the compelling case that freedom for the wolf does not mean freedom for the sheep. If you want to have a society where wolves are enabled maximal freedom, then that's going to entail that the sheep are going to be in chains, right? And reactionaries are absolutely right in this respect, that to a certain extent, undermining various forms of hierarchical organization in the names of equality is going to limit the freedom of certain kinds of groups within society that benefit in many ways from the retention of these forms of hierarchical organization. And I think much of American libertarianism is precisely a defense of this kind of idea, right? That freedom of the wolf is not going to mean freedom for the lamb, and what we should be committed to is freedom for the wolf rather than necessarily freedom for the lamb. By contrast, right, socialist freedom needs to be predicated on the idea that the free development of each is important, but that can only be carried out through the free development of all, which is where the egalitarian dimension of this comes in very predominantly, right? And I think that you see many expressions of this over the course of the socialist tradition, where there's a recognition that muting the forms of domination that exist in society will entail limiting the power of the capitalist class, for example, to exploit, much like limiting the freedom of the aristocrats to exploit their serfs is going to limit their freedom. But the net payoff in terms of human emancipation is going to more than offset that, right? And I think this is an especially important conversation to have in the contemporary age when more and more reactionary theorists, like Bronze Age Pervert, for example, drawing in a Nietzschean vein, are arguing very overtly that we should be committed to this idea that freedom for the lamb is unimportant. The only thing that matters is freedom for the wolf, because the wolves are the highest forms of human animals, and who cares about, as you put it, the dross that happen to do the things like cleaning toilets in our society. They want equality while they don't deserve it.
Where's the mic?
Thanks for your presentation. I was going to ask a question about Orthodox Marxism. Do you have more of a problem with the Orthodox Marxist theoretical attempt to overcome bourgeois right and be the gravedigger heir and successor of the bourgeois revolution, which admittedly can seem kind of spooky and illiberal? Or do you have more of a problem with the consequentialist moral problems with Orthodox Marxist praxis that occurred as the result of failure to be sufficiently Orthodox Marxist, like atrocities, purges, and the failure of the Stalinist command economy? Thank you.
Well, I definitely have a lot of problems with the second one, right? And we don't need to get into that too much here, because last thing I want to do is relitigate Soviet history, right? But on the first point, right, my problem with certain forms of Orthodox Marxism is, I hate to sound like an apostle, is that I don't think that they're actually truly Marxist, right? So I think a close reading of the critique of the Gotha program, where Marx very transparently is criticizing various kinds of Lassallean socialism, sees him point out that right can only be as high as the mode of production, right? This idea that you could simply subsume bourgeois right and establish a new theory of right in its place through revolutionary agitation is fundamentally anti-dialectical, right? And in the critique of the Gotha program, again, he makes it very clear that in the transition to socialism, many forms of bourgeois right are still going to be present, because the older society will inevitably have stamped, that's his terminology, the new society to come. And it's only on the long horizon of history that we might be able to completely overcome or sublate the limitations of bourgeois right and move towards a society, again, where we can ascribe, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, right? Now, Marx then goes on to lay out certain kind of practical implications for this in terms of how people would be compensated in an early socialist system that I'm not all that persuaded by, and I'm not sure that anybody is, but I do think that this central point, that this idea that there's going to be a millenarian revolution where we'll wake up and everything is going to be different, could not be more undialectical, and I'm extremely critical of it, because my view is that that belongs to Badiou, not to Marx.
I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the last question. Maybe picking up on this question of Orthodox Marxism, and maybe the remarks about the night watchman state.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the issue as regards early modern history is not, obviously, for instance, Marx very famously talks about the role of the state as sort of hothouse developing capitalism in the primitive accumulation section at the end of the first volume of Capital, but it doesn't seem to me his intention at all to deny that the project of liberalism was the subordination of the state to society. And that indeed that is made quite explicit in liberal critiques of the absolutist state or of the English revolutionary state in crisis, the critique of mercantilism. By Adam Smith. And that seems to me to raise this question of your remarks on the critique of the Gotha program and Orthodox Marxism, where, and I think Stefan already also raised this issue of the goal in question, right? What Bernstein is denying is that capitalism breaks down, right? That there's an inevitability of capitalist breakdown, and there is an inevitability of revolution.
Right.
Right? It's not really the inevitability of socialism, right? It can be socialism or barbarism, right? The outcome of that of the inevitable revolution can be more and degraded capitalism. So it seems to me that, and it's also there in the Irving Howe question versus Bernstein, which is that there's a real reversal as regards like a Bernsteinian revisionist tradition and a kind of Miliband, Irving Howe, second half of the 20th century social democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And the fundamental issue there is the state. And the abandonment of the project of taking state power in a revolutionary way that, quote, smashes the state and to initiate a process of the withering away of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I raised the issue of social freedom,
Mm-hmm.
right? The free development of society as the outcome of the free development of individuals, right? It's not that the individual is more tangible. Society's as real, arguably more real than individuals, right? The individuals are coming and going. Society is going to be there, right? And so I guess I want you to address this dimension of breaking with Marxism, which is really the deep dialogue with, for instance, anarchism in the socialist tradition, which is the aspiration to the overcoming of the state as a badge of the immaturity of mankind and its sort of prehistoricity, right? That a genuinely human age will only emerge beyond the organized self-subordination and self-coercion of society through the state.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So I think to your first question, right, about Marxist theory of crisis, as you can broadly call it that, I think that there's still a lot of gas in that tank that is worth appreciating, right? Here I'll draw very heavily on David Harvey's really great text, 17 Contradictions. And I'm not sure if there are actually 17 contradictions that Marx detects in Capitalism. There are probably actually more of them, right? But I think that we can see the analytical power of his critique of political economy in how precisely he calls upon us to recognize that there is no solving certain kinds of economic crises under capitalism. There can only be a transition from one set of problems to another in this attempt to continuously evade the consequences of following contradictory imperatives. A very clear one that he brings up again is the tendency of capitalism to crises of underconsumption, right? That from a phenomenological standpoint, when a worker comes into their workplace, their boss sees them as just that, a worker, and is committed to this idea of reducing their wages to the extent possible because they'll be able to extract more surplus value from them. But then, of course, as soon as they exit the workplace and they enter into the broader public sphere, they're no longer a worker, they're a consumer. And they need to have high wages in order to consume effectively. And from the phenomenological standpoint of the person at the 7-Eleven, the fact that they don't have a lot of money is a very serious problem because they're a consumer, they should have money, and they should be able to spend it. Now, Harvey points out that capital can create solutions to this contradiction by offering people things like cheap credit, right? But we all know where that's going to wind up in the long run, since one is not resolving a crisis of underconsumption through the provision of cheap credit. One is just postponing the day of reckoning for a period of time, right? And we can list these on and on and on, but I think, again, there's still a lot of gas in that tank. The other core thing that I think is still central to Marxism that is more important than ever to appreciate is how Marx gives us an appreciation of the phenomenological dimensions of the mode of production and the way that this fundamentally relates back to power. So at University of Michigan not too long ago, we had a great young Marxist who came and gave a talk called Soren Mao, right? Me and David Zeglin organized that talk. And his book, Mute Compulsion, is precisely how human beings have this bizarre habit of establishing economic relations, which are then reified and impose various forms of power on people that they then naturalize and think cannot be confronted in any kind of meaningful way. And the example I gave in my review of Mao's book is when I was working at a grocery store when I was younger. We're not unionized. We were an independent grocery proudly, right? And we had a bunch of people come in and talk to us about trying to form a union, and they could not have been shown the door more quickly than they were. And what ended up happening is we had the boss. They came down to talk to us, and they were like, look, the reality is that we have a lot of competition in the town. There's a new grocery store opening up across the street. We just cannot have a union here, and besides, it'll be bad for you in the long run because you might have to close down. And from his standpoint, that's absolutely true, right? There was a grocery store opening up next door. If they paid us more wages, it might be difficult to compete with the new one that's opening there. But what's not interrogated through this reasoning is the fact that the social system is imposing these kinds of requirements on us, and they don't have to be this way, right? That a better world is possible if we decide to adopt a different disposition in relation to the economic relations that we choose to establish, and see them not as powers that operate over us, but powers that operate through us that can be changed by us.
But isn't that precisely what Marx is saying, that we can't actually change our economic relations or our social relations with one another, that the one thing that revolution's not going to change is our social relations, our what he calls bourgeois right, the prevalence of bourgeois right as social relations, that it's not a disposition, right, that the height of agency that is conceivable in socialism, the seizure of state power by the working class, would simply open up the potential for people over a long period of time in innumerable dimensions to begin to overcome this society because of altered political circumstances, but that there is, as it were, no way to legislate or to directly politically affect our social relations, that the best we can do is, as it were, open up the potential for the transformation of our social relations through a transformation in their political, as it were, enforcement.
Well, this is actually where I come back to the agentic question in Marxism. And this relates back to the question of Marx's methodology, right? So here I argue in the more contemporary vein that Marx is a lot more Hegelian than he was given credit for, in the sense that he thinks that crucial to the transition to socialism is going to be the level of self-consciousness that individuals take about their economic relations, which in turn enables them to recognize the necessity of having social relations, right? It's not that that's ever going to be overcome, but being able to take more control of them directly as a result of this level of self-consciousness. Now, what makes Marx distinct from Hegel, of course, is his argument that this can't be purely carried out at the ideational level by just going and handing workers something like Das Kapital, right? You actually need to change material conditions on the ground if you're going to enact this kind of transition in the way that people phenomenologically apprehend their life world, right? But I still think that that is a project that is worth holding on to, this kind of Hegelian core to Marxism. But to your final question about the relationship between anarchism and we might call liberal socialism, I have to admit, I have not engaged very extensively with the anarchist tradition outside of, quite frankly, anarcho-libertarianism. And I don't think anybody in this room is going to be sitting there being like, Murray Rothbard is my guy, right? We want to sign off on him. The primary criticism I could give of the forms of anarchism with which I am familiar, which would be this kind of Wolffian anarchism, is that it takes this very highly deontic viewpoint, which is fundamentally that any kind of exercise of state coercion is such a violation of individuals' autonomy that even if this is carried out with the goal of emancipating others, there's something that is fundamentally wrong with that. That's the kind of classic argument in defense of anarchism. And I just fundamentally don't buy that, right? I think that this desire to exist in a non-coercive society is extraordinarily admirable in a number of levels, but an emphasis on deontic non-interference as the sole thing that we have reason to care about, I think is misguided, because there are a lot of different things that we have reason to care about beyond just deontic non-interference. For instance, we have human flourishing that is worth being concerned with. There's equality that is worth being concerned about. There's human sociality that is worth being concerned about. And I'm not convinced necessarily that anarchism would be the best way of securing these other values that we have good reason to cherish, in addition to this commitment to deontic non-coercion, right? And here again, I'm echoing somebody like Rawls and pointing out that it is absolutely important not to be monoprincipled whenever we engage in political activity, because we should want to have a richer array of principles that we are going to be committed to, rather than just saying there's one and only one that is of central importance. But again, that is very provisional because I have not engaged extensively with anarchism, and I do not want to make broad claims about a tradition which I'm not nearly familiar enough to say anything intelligent about.
Just one last follow-up. I mean, isn't the heart of the Marxist critique of anarchism, I'm surely familiar with this, because this is there in the critique of the Gotha program, that, what do Marxists say about anarchists? They say they have no theory. They say they have no theory of what? Of the state, right? Of the necessity of the state, that the state is a product of the crisis of our social relations, and that the demand for the reconstitution of society politically, the demand for that workers make to be put to work, to recommodify themselves, is going to project out of it the necessity of a state, right, of a Bonapartist state that manages the crisis that is generated by that demand. And it seems to me that what Marxism is about, or at least Orthodox Marxism is about, for which, of course, the critique of the Gotha program is crucial, is the critique of the so-called free state that Marx makes there, right? Where what he's arguing is that to demand work, to demand that society address the crisis of its social relations, is to demand a coercive state. And the question is how to make that maximally politically apparent, right? That's what the demand for the dictatorship of the proletariat is about. It's about making it clear to the working class that their freedom is alienated from themselves by forcing them to enforce their own demand for work, for for the commodity form of social relations. And in that sense, it's about heightening consciousness, not of the goal, but of the contradictory character of their social position as the proletariat, right? And therefore, to open up the question of the breakdown of capitalism, right, as a self-conscious project, right? So I guess, to me, maybe that was a dream, right? Maybe that was a very misguided project. But it does seem to me, and it hasn't worked out very well, this whole Orthodox Marxism, it's not kind of trump card that I'm trying to play here. It's simply that it does seem to me to get to the heart of the issue of liberalism, right? Because it seems to me that we have to abandon a traditional conception of liberalism that imagines the free development of society on the basis of a historically emergent individuality, right? That the emergence of the individual under bourgeois society is to be unleashed, right? That in some sense, socialism is the achievement of the bourgeois project. I mean, I always, when I read Marx's description of communism as the freedom of each will be the precondition of the freedom of all, I thought, well, anyone could say that. Like, Locke could have said that, Kant could have said that, Hegel could have said that, right? And that's the point of it, right? Is that that his project is one of, in a sense, fulfilling the desiderata of liberalism, right? In an age of their crisis, and I guess I wonder, how much of not only do we have to retrieve from liberalism, but how much do we have to sacrifice of liberalism in this liberal socialist vision?
Okay. I'm aware that we are over time, so...
This is the last hit.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be really very brief, because I can see a lot of people probably want to have a cigarette and go to the washroom and all that stuff. So, very briefly, right, on the anarchism point, again, I don't want to say anything sustained about this, because it would be very foolish of me to engage comprehensively with a tradition that I'm not very familiar with. I have always been sympathetic to David Harvey's argument in Listen Anarchist, where he points out that to be an anarchist without being a Marxist is fundamentally problematic, because what Marxism offers to anarchism is a theory of power and a theory of transition above all else. That's absolutely central, because if your argument is simply that we must do away with the state without recognizing how various forms of social power will be required to undo the capitalist mode of production that might require the exercise of state power, then it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to achieve any long-term anarchist society that could actually be functioning in any kind of reasonable sense. And I think here you can see an echo in Harvey of Marx's critique of utopian socialism, right? Except in this case directed towards anarchism. Now again, whether or not that's applicable to all forms of anarchism, I'm going to plead the fifth on, right? In terms of the relationship between liberalism and Marxism one more time, I think that very clearly, right, Marx is committed to a kind of normative individualism. Rodney Peffer makes this point very nicely in his book, Marxism and Morality, in the sense that what he is really committed to is this idea that under capitalist conditions, it is very difficult for people to become, to use the term, multi-sided, right? In the sense that we are able to develop our more basic human capacities, since in many circumstances we are required to exercise our capacities purely for the purposes of capitalist production. And in the German ideology, a problematic text, no doubt, he makes this kind of joke with Engels about how, we're going to be fishers in the morning and hunters in the afternoon and critics in the evening without ever becoming fisher or hunter and critic. Now that's a joke, but there's a serious core to this, with the idea that under capitalism, when we are required to simply become mechanical beings producing surplus value, we are not able to develop and refine our capacities, and that within a socialist society that is freer and more equal, this possibility will become open to us. And again, to come back to my favorite quote, I think that he remained true to this division even in Capital Volume 3, where he talks again about the development of human powers becoming an end in of itself for the first time as we move away from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. Now, the relationship of this with liberalism is, again, there is a form of liberalism that is committed to an acquisitive ethic that sees life as exclusively about the production, extraction, and consumption of goods. And again, this can go back to people like Jeremy Bentham, for example. But there's another version of liberalism in the writings of people like Mary Wollstonecraft, especially, or in the writing of black radical liberals like Charles Mills, that does emphasize this importance of the development of human powers as truly necessary, as what is truly necessary in order to secure a life of flourishing for all. And that also stresses the social dimension to this. And so it's this version of liberalism that, of course, liberal socialism is committed to, with a developmental ethic at its heart rather than an acquisitive one.
Can everyone please thank our guest, Matt McManus. Thank you.